I've found in my classes here is that the kids come in with a high degree of respect for the founders, for the founding documents, but they don't know the arguments. They haven't ever really learned what were they thinking. What is it that links these ideas of being born with a natural right to liberty, government by consent of the governed, separation of powers, government that protects the right to use property, government that protects free markets. They believe in all those things, but how are they all connected logically? Founders had an explanation for all that, which is what animates the Constitution and what I think makes intelligible what was once the American way of life and what could be again if that understanding could be restored.
Hello, my name is Jacob. I'm a junior majoring in political economy at Hillsdale College. This is part of a 10-week course, Constitution 101, presented by Hillsdale College. Today you'll hear from Dr. Tom West, the Paul and Don Potter Professor of Politics, on the Declaration of Independence. Please watch.
The soul of the American founding is to be located in the universal political principles of the Declaration of Independence. This is a fact that is often denied today. Scholars often prefer to see the founding in terms of a combination of Christianity or the English legal tradition or the U.S. Constitution or some blend of all of these. But what the argument I'm going to make here is that the principles of the founding are to be found essentially in the principles of the Declaration of Independence, and that's what helps us to understand everything else that's in the founding, especially the Constitution. And that's why we're doing this topic in a course on the Constitution. Now, one of the things I've noticed is that conservatives often like this idea that the Declaration of Independence and the political theory of the Declaration is not that important. The reason for that is because they are often uncomfortable with the language of liberty and equality. They think that that is the kind of language that leads into 20th and 21st century liberalism. And so that makes them nervous. Is the Declaration of Independence the source of all of that? That's their concern. As for liberals, they don't like the founders' principles either, but their objection is different. Their concern is that the founders had the right terms, liberty and equality, but they didn't put the right content into those terms. One of the favorite documents of liberals is the 1948 United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And in that declaration, there's a right to Social Security, right to rest and leisure, a right of every person to a standard of living adequate for health and well-being of himself and his family. And of course, what liberals notice is the founders didn't have any of those rights in their lists of human rights. More recently, the liberals have added an additional fundamental human right. A recent speech by Hillary Clinton. The United States, she said, is dedicated to, quote, protecting the rights of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community worldwide, unquote. Now, when we think about the founders, we go back to thinking about what their view was as opposed to what the current concerns are. You do have to start off by admitting they did not, in fact, create a government completely in accordance with their own principles. That has to be admitted. There's no question slavery was in conflict with what they said government should do, which is to protect everybody's equal rights. And, of course, that's often said to be a reason we should reject the founders and not look back towards them for any guidance. But, in fact, what you see in the founding is that, yes, they did have slavery, but they inherited this institution. It existed before the founding. It came to them from the British colonial period, and they knew there was something wrong with it and said so over and over. And then, based on their knowledge that it was wrong, they went ahead and tried to get rid of it. They didn't succeed in every state. They succeeded in many states. Every state had slavery as a legal institution in 1776. And by the early 1800s, slavery had been abolished in 8 of those states. That's the achievement that we have to recognize. There was an awareness of it as a problem. It wasn't solved, but it was a problem, and that means that we can, in fact, accept their principles. Slavery does not mean their principles were wrong. It means that their principles were not completely and fully lived up to. So the question then has to be, let's go back and look at the principles. What are they? Everyone's familiar with the key terms of the Declaration of Independence. Everybody's heard about equality, created equal, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, consent of the governed. And we've heard it so often that I think we no longer know what those words mean. And one reason for that, one reason we don't know what those words mean anymore so often, as often as we should, is that those words have been adopted and taken over by liberals and given a different meaning. Today, the idea of equality, for example, means that every person should have the same resources as every other person, at least with regard to enjoying, and I'll quote that UN Declaration again, the economic, social, and cultural rights indispensable for the dignity and free development of the personality, unquote. Minority groups today are said to be denied their equal rights if they are not hired in proportion to their percentage of the population. Liberty today is said to mean that if you cannot afford to pay for something that is a right, then you're being denied that right. And government needs to give you the money or the resources so that you can exercise that right effectively. So if you need money to travel, then government needs to provide public transportation. If you can't buy a house, government needs to provide public housing. That's the logic of liberalism. Now, this is very different from the founders' conception of rights. In their view, the right to liberty is fundamentally a right to be free from the right to be free from the coercive interference of other people. They did not think liberty was a right to demand money and services from other people, with one really important exception. They did believe that there's a basic right to what we would call minimal welfare, meaning if you're truly destitute, there's no one there to care for you, no family, or there's something disabled, government did have a responsibility to step in and provide for you in that rare case. It was not expected to be a common case, and it wasn't common, because for most people, the family and self-reliance was sufficient. That's a topic I've covered in my book, Vindicating the Founders, in the chapter on welfare. Now, why do we have the Declaration of Independence to start with? It helps to think about that a little bit, too, before we get into the specific arguments. In the 18th century, starting around, let's say, about 1790 or 1690 or so, so for about 80 years before the founding, America and Great Britain had a very uneasy relationship. Essentially, you had the Americans trying to govern themselves through their elected legislatures, but constantly running into difficulties with the governors of the colonies, who were usually appointed by the king. You had royal governors, elected legislatures. The arrangement, as I say, was uneasy, but it more or less functioned. Each side was willing, and when the crunch came, was able to get along with the other. What changed, though, was the French and Indian War. England conquered France, and that meant the end of any significant military threat to the colonies from then on. That led to two things. First of all, it meant that the colonists were no longer so concerned about the protection offered by British arms. And what it meant for the British was, we no longer have to coddle these guys. They'll come, we can make them pay their share of what it takes to govern the empire. So we'll start putting taxes on them, and we'll start restraining their local liberty, That's what the British were doing. And on the other side, the Americans were saying, that's not going to happen because we don't need you guys. And that's what created the basis of the clash. And it was like a stone rolling downhill from 1763 at the end of that war with France to 1776. It was just one quarrel after another in which each side became more and more stubborn. And finally, the Americans declared independence. Now, the Declaration of Independence has three parts, and it comes right out of this controversy. First part states what are the general principles of government. Second part is what is it that the British have been doing that's so bad. Third was, since they've been so bad, since they have been violating our rights, and since they haven't been allowing us to govern ourselves by the consent of the governed, we're going to declare independence. That's the conclusion. So that's the structure of the Declaration. And now I want to turn to the specific arguments. First of all, created equal. What does that mean? One of the most common errors we can deal with immediately and say, all men are created equal, does not mean all males are created equal. No one in the founding era believed that women don't have rights. Whenever the question of individual rights comes up in other founding documents, common parallel expressions are the rights of humanity, the rights of all persons, and so on. So there's never, it was simply men in the generic sense of human beings that are created equal. Secondly, what does created equal actually mean? To get clear on that, which is really essential to making sense of the founding, it's helpful to look at some of the other statements made during that period by major elected bodies that wrote constitutions and other forms of declarations, other statements of declarations of principles. For example, the Virginia Bill of Rights. In the Virginia Bill, it starts off, doesn't say created equal at the beginning, it says instead, all men are by nature equally free and independent. It's essentially a parallel version of created equal, equally free and independent. What it means is, it's a fact of human life that human beings are not naturally subordinated to each other. One of the sermons of the day by a man named a preacher named Gad Hitchcock puts it this way, quote, "In the state of nature, men are equal, exactly on a par in regard to authority," unquote. Equal means equal in regard to authority, equally free, which means you are independent of all authority or rule by other human beings. Equality in the founder's sense, therefore, is not a product of law or social construction of government policy. Created equal means that equality is something human beings are born with. They possess by nature, just by virtue of being a human being in existence. And it is true, we can be deprived of that natural equality by force. We can also voluntarily give up, to some extent, that natural equality when we submit to government by our own consent. Children, of course, are ruled by their parents without their consent, but once they reach the age of reason, they are free of all rule from others until coercion or consent changes that. No one is born to be a slave of another person, including one's parents, when he or she becomes an adult. Equality does not mean anything more than this. It certainly does not mean that all human beings have a right to equal access to the good things of life. People don't have a natural right to a minimum wage, health care, education paid for by the society. It means that no one is by nature the ruler of any other person. After the statement of equality, the Declaration of Independence immediately adds that human beings are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So equality, it starts with equality. It's a fact of the human condition. We're all born equal in regard to the authority of others. But then, immediately, there is this moral statement made. We have rights. And the relationship of those two phrases, those two ideas, equality and individual rights, is that from that equal liberty that we're born with, we have equal natural rights, meaning we have equal claims that we are able to make just by virtue of our nature, just because we're alive as human beings, as rational animals, against others. The natural rights, in other words, are nothing more than statements of the moral claim we have against others if they threaten to take away the liberty, the equal liberty, that equally free and independent condition that we're born with. People are allowed, therefore, because of that equal liberty, to take measures they think necessary to preserve themselves. That's the right to life. They have the liberty to do as they please. They have the right to the liberty, among other things, to pursue happiness. The founders' doctrine of natural rights is at base nothing more than a restatement of the idea that, except for the temporary state of childhood, we're all born free and independent of the control of other people, and that we deserve to keep that freedom and that independence if we so choose. In the Virginia Bill of Rights, which I've already mentioned, two other rights are mentioned that are fundamental in the founding era. One is the right to acquire and possess property, which means that a just economic order will establish market freedom, enabling the poor to acquire property by keeping or selling the fruits of their own labor or selling their labor to other people. The founders did not believe in a right to possess property except in the condition that others who don't have it will be in a position to acquire property of their own. Those two things were absolutely necessary parts of the same idea, because the rights are rights that benefit everyone. The other fundamental right in the founding is in the Virginia formulation, the free exercise of religion according to the dictates of conscience. These five basic rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, acquiring and possessing property, free exercise of religion, sum up what it is that human beings have by nature and what they deserve to keep. In other words, what they are rightfully able to claim for themselves against other people who might want to take that away. Because they're rights, they're also duties. If you and I have a right to liberty, each of us has a duty not to make the other a slave. Property rights means that stealing is forbidden. If we possess a right to life, we have a duty not to commit murder. The founders sometimes formulated their idea of natural rights in the language of duty, such as in the first sentence of the Declaration of Independence. The laws of nature and of nature's God entitle every nation to a separate and equal station among the powers of the earth. It says there, the laws of nature justify national independence and forbid the imperialistic domination of one nation over other nations. This is because all men are created equal and all have the same right to liberty, whether individually or collectively. No nation is allowed to rule any other nation for the same reason that no individual is allowed to rule any other individual without that person's consent. What then do these principles tell us about government? The Declaration answer is, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. This implies that rights are insecure in the absence of government, in a condition that the founders called the state of nature. Thomas Paine explains it this way, quote, government, like dress, is the badge of lost innocence. If the impulses of conscience, he says, were clear, uniform, and irresistibly obeyed, man would need no other lawgiver, unquote. Jefferson builds on this same thought when he says that in the state of nature, quote, wicked and dissolute men, meaning those who do not obey the impulses of conscience, mentioned by Paine, wicked and dissolute men, when they are not restrained by government, commit violations on the lives, liberties, and property of others. Government would be defective in its principal purpose were it not to restrain such criminal acts by inflicting due punishments on those who perpetrate them. And that's the first thing the government has to do to secure these rights. It has to create a criminal law in which people who harm life, liberty, and property will be punished. Second, in addition to the criminal law, government also protects the citizen's person and property by its civil laws. What do the civil laws do? Well, property is defined and deeds are recorded so that everybody knows who owns what. There are going to be clear legal standards for contracts in civil law. Contracts that can be then enforced in courts of law when people refuse to perform what they've promised. The lawsuits for personal injury are part of the civil law. They must be provided for so that people can be compensated for harm that they receive from other people in their person and property. And then finally, the civil law defines the procedure for getting married, for getting divorced, as well as the duties of parents to children and children to parents. There has to be a way for society to provide for the procreation and adequate education of children. That's done essentially through the institution of the family, defined and supported in the civil law. The third thing government has to do to secure these rights is it's got to create a national defense. It has to organize the armed forces of the community to deter and, if need be, to defeat aggression, foreign attacks on life and liberty and property. And that becomes the fundamental guide to foreign policy. It's for national defense. And it's not for anything else. It certainly would not include a mission to spread democracy to other nations by force of arms, as most politicians today believe. Finally, on the basis of these, in order to make sure that these three political things work effectively, there is a fourth consideration, and that is that government, in order to secure the rights of the individual, needs to have a moral basis. The Virginia Bill of Rights contains this statement: no free government can be preserved to any people but by a firm adherence to justice, moderation, temperance, frugality, and virtue, and by frequent recurrence to fundamental principles, unquote. This language is repeated in the federal law of the Northwest Ordinance, passed in the same period. Religion, morality, and knowledge are necessary for good government and the happiness of mankind, unquote. It was this concern that led the founders' generation to policies involved that led to government support of cultivation of good character through religion, public education, and stable marriage. That's how government's supposed to secure our rights, and those are the policies that the founders thought were necessary. And really, that's about all they thought was necessary to secure these rights. But there's a final consideration here, and that is, it's not enough for government to have the right goals. It's also necessary for government to be structured on the right foundation. Government means people telling you what to do and punishing you if you don't do it, which means taking away your liberty. The only way that that coercive power of government can be made consistent with this fundamental, equally free and independent character of human life is through the consent of the governed. The people have to agree to let the government govern them. That then legitimates it when government takes away their liberty by telling them what to do. The practical meaning of the consent principle is that there have to be elections, or there has to be government of the people acting in person. Now, some people point out, some scholars have noted the fact that in the Declaration of Independence, there's all this talk about King George, as if it was okay for him to rule us in the colonial period, as long as he hadn't misbehaved so badly. They're correct in noting that point, but what they don't notice is that the criteria for King George's correct behavior are stated in the Declaration of Independence list of grievances. The first grievance is, he's been vetoing our laws. And the last grievance is that he, together with Parliament, that the last grievance actually among the list of domestic policy grievances is, that he, together with Parliament, have declared themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. In other words, what's the complaint? The complaint is the king isn't allowing us to govern ourselves by the consent of our elected legislatures. So in other words, we're okay with monarchy as long as the monarch defers to what the people want as passed in the laws created by their representatives. Which means to say, it's not really a monarchy, it's a republic that is being defended there. Now, there's a conflict, potential conflict, between these two criteria of good government: consent of the governed, securing these rights. There's a potential conflict because what if the people consent to policies that don't secure these rights? This is a very common thing in the history of human affairs. Whenever you have democratic institutions, people are often making mistakes about the policies that they enact through their representatives. As I say, the founders had a very clear sense of what it is that the government has to do in order to secure these rights, and what if the people don't do that? This is not just a theoretical problem. We had the example of slavery in the founding era. We know for sure that the founders, in some respects, failed to create a government that consistently secured the rights of the people under it on the basis of consent of the governed. So how can those things be made consistent with each other? Well, as I say, they probably can never be fully consistent, but there are a lot of things that government can do to make it more likely that what the people want is going to be consistent with securing their rights. I've already mentioned one of those things, which is to create a policy where you try to shape the moral character of the people, make them want to obey the law, make them good citizens. But there are lots of other things that are necessary, and that will be a theme of some of the other lectures in this series. Separation of powers, federalism, separate powers given to local, state, and national governments, list of rights and bills of rights. There are lots of things that government can do to structure itself in a way to make it more likely that it will be consistent with the rights of the individual. What does all this lead to? It's not just a procedural thing. A lot of scholars will say, oh, the founders, all they cared about was procedure. They just wanted to create a system in which people understood the rules and then could live any way they wanted to. That's not what the founders thought they were doing. They thought of themselves as creating a way of life in which people would live together under the laws of nature, respecting each other's rights. Violence to life and limb would be rare because of an effective criminal law that punishes people for violating the rights of others. This would be a situation or a life, a society in which people could worship God in the way they think best without the interference of other people or of government. Each person was free to use his talents or his property, to acquire property through voluntary transactions. Each person is assured that property will be safe from the thievery of others. Families would be free from the micromanagement of outsiders. Dealings among adult human beings would be based on personal choice and contracts, and in the case of group activities, on freedom of association. In the founders' vision of the good society, peace, harmony, friendship, love, and happiness would flourish on the basis of self-governing political communities, self-governing private associations, the family, businesses, schools, and stable families. To sum it all up, and I'll quote George Washington in his letter to the Hebrew congregation in Newport, "Everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid." To understand the founders' conception of individual rights and government by consent, consider in contrast the view that prevails in today's liberalism, according to which human rights are no longer based on human nature. In 1944, Franklin Roosevelt called for a second Bill of Rights, which would include, and I'll mention some of these rights, the right to earn enough to provide adequate food and clothing and recreation, the right of every family to a decent home, the right to adequate medical care, to a good education, and many more. What Roosevelt meant was that if government fails to fund the right, one cannot be said to have the right. His idea was, can I really be said to enjoy a right to liberty if my low income limits my opportunities for entertainment? Liberty includes the right to drive, but what good is that right if I don't have a car? The liberal conclusion is there must be a right to health care, food, clothing, shelter, and to an income high enough to allow us to satisfy all of our desires. In the modern liberal conception of rights, liberty requires not just protection against being injured by others, but positive government programs, providing or mandating aid to those who are thought not to have enough wealth. Harvard professor John Rawls argued that those who have less have a moral right to take possessions of those who have more. In this view, rights are no longer derived from human nature. Human autonomy instead replaces the idea of individual liberty as a natural right. But human autonomy does not come from the natural. It comes from the deliberate remaking of the current state of society with a view to maximizing every person's liberation from natural limitations. The realization of that ideal requires that those who have intelligence, ambition, sobriety, wealth, education, and so on, have to be compelled to support those who do not have the same talents or fortunes. Rights derive not from what one has in common with other human beings, the same human nature. Instead, rights come from whatever makes oneself inferior to others, victimizations or victim status. The more one is a victim, the more rights you have against others. The founders' view was rights are based on what we are, what human beings are by nature. We have our life, our liberty, our talent to acquire property and pursue happiness. That's what government's there to protect. For the founders, a right to decent housing, let alone a right to recreation, would be nearly unintelligible. A natural right, to repeat, is a just claim against someone who would deprive a person of what is naturally his own or what is acquired by his own labor without harm to others or through voluntary transactions with others. No one possesses by nature, in the founders' view, food, learning, and free access to medical care. No one possesses the kind of autonomy demanded by liberals today. The lack of such things does not create a rightful claim against others to provide them. It does nothing more than to leave each person free to provide such things for himself. I mentioned before, and I'll repeat it though, the founders did not believe people in a condition of absolute destitution should be allowed to starve. Then they said, yes, government needs to step in. There has to be a safety net. But they viewed it as a safety net. It was not a general right to demand goods and services of others for the sake of a right to recreation, to use Franklin Roosevelt's one of his examples. Now, I'd like to finish by going back to the amalgam thesis I started off with. This is the thesis that sees the founding as a blend of the universal principles of natural rights with other traditions tied to colonial English and Christian heritage. Scholars sometimes argue that this is an amalgam of conflicting elements. Christianity, British constitutionalism, the tradition of American republicanism, these are supposedly in some dimensions incompatible with natural rights. And I'm quoting a major scholar there. I don't see any evidence in the founding of any incompatibility between the Christian, the common law, the English heritage, any of those other dimensions of the founding with the theory of natural rights and natural law that we've just gone through. Founding era Christianity did not stand in tension with natural rights because most Christians believed that God commands us not to interfere with other people's forms of worship. Protestants thought that the New Testament favors a republican form of government. We see this in the Gad Hitchcock sermon I quoted earlier, prominent preacher in Massachusetts, time of the founding. The first Catholic bishop in America, John Carroll, appeals in one of his writings to, quote, the luminous principles on which the rights of conscience and liberty of religion depend, unquote. And that was a teaching that he came up with almost 2 centuries before the Catholic Church officially embraced the doctrine of religious toleration at the Second Vatican Council of 1965. As for the common law heritage of the American founding, the founders did not, in fact, accept it indiscriminately. They ruthlessly got rid of any part of it that was judged to be incompatible with the laws of nature, such as primogeniture, the idea that inheritance should automatically go to the oldest son, or any kind of privileges assigned by law to a hereditary aristocracy. New York's Constitution of 1777 made this position explicit. The common law of England, it said there, is still in force, with this exception, quote, all such parts of the common law that are repugnant to this Constitution are abrogated and rejected, unquote. New York's Constitution, like all the state constitutions at that time, was intended to secure these rights, as stated in the preamble to the New York Constitution, which quotes the entire Declaration of Independence. The authority of the common law, no less before than after 1776, was limited by the standard of natural right. I suggest that a better analogy for understanding the founding is not amalgam, but a horse and a rider. What I mean is this: the horse represents whatever made colonial Americans what they were. Besides the universal facts of human nature, that would include the geography of America, the laws, the racial stock, the popular sentiments, moral habits, religion, and the rest. The rider of the horse would represent the politicians informed by the natural law philosophy who were chosen by the people as their rulers. The horse is not something that the statesman can create. It's composed of brute facts over which he has no control. He inherits the colonial population and its ways. But the horse can be guided in the right direction if the rider is skillful. But the rider has to work with the facts and traditions that he is given. If the horse is too lame, too stupid, slavish, or stubborn, the rider might not be able to ride very far with him. He might get thrown off. There are limits, in other words, to what any statesman, however prudent, can do with the people and traditions he inherits, especially if he is riding them with their consent. The right to liberty and the right to acquire property are universal rights. They belong to human beings everywhere. But what history and experience teach us is that it is difficult, and therefore it's rare, to establish a political order that protects that natural liberty. Most people in most places, and this is due to their prejudices, habits, dispositions, ignorance, simply lack the qualities necessary to create a free society. In the founding, Americans got lucky. The horse, the American colonial population and its heritage, happened to be unusually healthy. It was already habituated to going more or less in the right direction, and it was eager to accept the direction of prudent rulers. Hamilton understood this point perfectly. He wrote in one of his letters, "I hold with Montesquieu that a government must be fitted to a nation as much as a coat to the individual, and consequently, what may be good at Philadelphia may be bad at Paris and ridiculous in Russia." The founders inherited a colonial tradition, English law, Protestant Christianity, and Republican political institutions that was warmly supported by the people. Educated preachers and politicians had long accepted the modern natural rights teaching, which became the official basis of the founding. What marred the colonial state of things from the point of view of that teaching was the persistence of certain British traditions that were opposed either to government by consent, such as the royal governors, or to the security of individual rights, such as the laws against requiring primogeniture. Most governors, as I mentioned, were appointed by the king, royal vetoes were common. And then after 1763, Parliament started on its campaign to impose taxation on the colonies without their consent. Finally, in 1769, the Parliament openly asserted the colonists have no right to govern themselves at all. Parliament will prevail, quote, in all cases whatsoever, unquote. The American Revolution could never have succeeded, so far as it did succeed, without something like that accidentally pre-existing colonial religious and legal tradition, the healthy and intelligent horse. But at the same time, the revolution would not have taken the direction it did and become the basis of a successful republic without the leading role of that natural rights theory. Thank you.